One other topic I want to get into is what happens after a disturbance. There's a process called succession that takes place after a disturbance happens, and in general, it can take place with all sorts of kinds of organisms. But what we're usually interested in when we talk about succession is plant succession. Succession comes in a couple different flavors. There's what's called primary succession, and that's when you have a community that is establishing itself in an area where there's never been life, or at least there hasn't been life for an incredibly long time. This is the kind of succession that you see in areas where the land was just made out of lava. Boiling rock bubbled up out of the Earth's crust. It hardened, it cooled, it became an island, and now plants are trying to start making a living on it. That's the process of primary succession, as those plants the first plants become established and other ones follow and so on. This can also happen in areas where there's been a glacier covering an area of Earth for thousands of years. As that glacier melts and retreats, it exposes soil that has not seen the light of day, um, maybe since human beings left Africa. For all functional purposes, there's never been anything living on that area. And so as organisms get established there and start to multiply and other organisms come in and grow and the community starts to build itself up, that's primary succession. Now, one thing that you have to know about community ecology is it can be a really frustrating field of study because almost everything in community ecology, if you ask a question about a community ecology, almost always the answer is, well, it depends. There are very few general principles that hold true in community ecology across all sorts of communities. Interestingly, succession is one of the few that is generally reliable. You can actually predict in a particular habitat what is going to happen over the course of succession if that course of succession maybe takes, 100 or 200 years. So for example, here's an example of primary succession, one of those areas where a glacier has receded. What you get is you get these very, very low-growing pioneer plants, things called epilobium, um, and then you get smaller plants, sort of heath plants that come in and replace those. Those are in turn replaced by alders, very short trees. Eventually you start seeing spruce trees showing themselves amongst the alders, and slowly the spruce trees are going to replace more and more of the alders until essentially you have an entire spruce forest and very few alders present at all. And you will see this sequence happening wherever you see, glaciers in a particular habitat withdrawing. Okay, we're not going to talk too much about primary succession because islands that are just being formed out of lava and retreating glaciers are relatively rare. What is much more common is what's called secondary succession. Secondary succession is what happens in a community after there was an existing, well-established community and part or all of it was removed by some kind of disturbance. Okay, over time, what happens is this predictable sequence of species that replace one another. What I want you to think about is the traits that allow a species to come in and dominate an area right after after a disturbance, has occurred. And you should be able to think about these things in light of what you were learning a lecture ago about R-selected and K-selected species. A similar related question is, there are certain traits that allow a species to dominate an area, but only after a long period of time has passed. What traits are those? Where do those map out on the spectrum between R-selected and K-selected species? What you see in succession is basically the same predictable set of species coming in. So for example, if you have a forest that's been cleared to leave a field, what you're first going to see are very quick growing very small plants with very small seeds. Those are going to be the first to establish. They're going to grow and proliferate in large numbers, and they're going to grow very rapidly to maturity, generating lots and lots of seeds each. Later on, what's going to happen is those plants are going to be replaced with slightly higher plants that often produce fewer seeds, take longer to come to maturity, and the seeds that they produce may be larger. Those are going to be replaced by still larger plants. Each individual has more biomass, but they tend to grow slowly. They tend to be much more efficient with nutrients than the small, quick-growing plants that came before. And they tend to be very, very good competitors. Finally, the only things that you're starting to see in an area may be really pretty large, long-lived organisms. Organisms that are very efficient, organisms that tend to have large propagules, and organisms that often just establish themselves in an area by outliving everything else around them. And eventually you reach what's called a climax community. And this is a community that once it is in place, essentially just replaces itself over and over and over again until there's another disturbance. There are certain trends that you see in succession that are quite reliable. One of them is the one that's most obvious in the pictures here. If you look at this black curve, the biomass in an area will just continue going up and up and up as you approach that climax community. It's only once a climax community is fully established and fully grown that biomass finally levels off. The productivity of a ecosystem, the amount of energy that's being taken in by that ecosystem and potentially passed along to consumers, rises very quickly at first, but levels off well before you get to that climax community. So at some point, you stop getting any gains in productivity. The growth of more plant matter, the growth of more biomass, is not increasing the amount of energy that the forest is taking in. It's just changing which species are taking it in. And here's the interesting trend. The number of species that you see over the course of time during succession is very low at first, and then reaches a maximum here in the middle, and then falls off again to a moderate number that stays the same over time once the climate community is in place. We're going to be doing a classroom exercise about disturbance and succession, so I'm not going to go into much more detail about that. But hopefully by the time you're done with the exercise, you'll understand something about why succession works the way that it does. This hump in the middle of this curve is an interesting pattern. And it's related to a set of very nifty experiments that were done off the California coast some number of years ago. Here's the map of the California coast right just off Los Angeles. I believe that the experiments were done at this site up here in Elwood near Santa Barbara on the rocky coast facing the Pacific Ocean. These experiments involved a couple of species. Let me introduce you to this cast of characters. This is called sea lettuce. It's a green sea alga named ulva. There are these barnacles shown here. And then there's this red alga, which has a very different growth form, is capable of overgrowing the other species. What experimenters noticed when they were going out and looking along this coast is that you found different communities of these organisms on different sized rocks. When you looked at a small boulder, what you saw was the green sea lettuce and the barnacles. When you looked at one of these larger rocks, what you saw was the red alga instead. And the hypothesis that some researchers came up to was what was happening was a matter of disturbance. Small rocks can get rolled over by even small storms. And when one of these rocks gets rolled over, that's going to annihilate all of the organisms that were living on top of it, because now the top is the bottom, and those organisms are not able to get any sunlight or food. Okay? Large rocks, on the other hand, can only be displaced by the largest of storms. And so you have a much lower rate of disturbance on these large rocks. Every storm that comes through and flips over a rock is a very severe disturbance for all of the organisms living on that rock. And because it takes a bigger storm to flip a bigger rock, those bigger rocks simply experience less in the way of disturbances. What those experimenters needed to do in order to show that disturbance was responsible for this and not simply the size of the rock was they needed to control one of the variables. And the way they did this is they controlled for the rate of disturbance by taking small rocks and bolting them down so that they could not be moved by small storms. So what you had is you had boulders of different sizes, but they had both experienced the same rate of disturbance. This is what you should have learned when you were studying the ground squirrels, these many lectures ago, is that sometimes you have variables that are confounded, and you have to come up with an experimental design to separate them. What you're seeing here is a case of an experimental design that separates the size of a boulder from the rate of disturbance that communities on those boulders experience. So the question is, what's going to happen when you bolt one of these little boulders in place? Is it going to grow the green lettuce and the barnacles, the green sea lettuce and the barnacles, or is it going to tend to grow the red algae? If it grows the sea lettuce and the barnacles, it tells you there's simply something different between small rocks and big rocks that favors the sea lettuce and the barnacles on the small rocks. Well, what they actually saw was this. As soon as you slowed down the disturbance rate on these small rocks, this red alga took over. Basically, it's because this algae grows very slowly. It takes a long time to get established, but it's a better competitor than the sea lettuce or the barnacles. It will eventually crowd them out. The only way that the sea lettuce and the barnacles can make a living on this rocky coastline is by getting in, growing up on a rock, reproducing, getting their propagules out there into the environment before the next storm comes along and flips the rock over, or before the red alga comes along and smothers them. So they've got this very narrow window of time that they need to exploit, and they do that by growing very quickly to maturity and having lots of propagules, some of which might hit the jackpot. This is the general difference between these two lifestyles. You have some organisms that are what are called colonists. Their strategy is to find resources that are not being exploited. They are very quick to exploit resources. They grow to maturity very quickly, and they send out an enormous number of propagules, whether those seeds or offspring. And so they can take advantage of resources as soon as they're made available. Because they have lots of propagules, they tend to be able to reach resources first. So when there's a disturbance, when a rock is flipped over in the intertidal and all of a sudden there's a bare rock that hasn't been colonized by anything, the green lettuce, the green sea lettuce here, is much more likely to colonize it than the red alga, because there are more green sea lettuce propagules floating around in the water. So the algae will get in there first, it'll grow up a couple generations, send out as many propagules as it can, and then eventually it will get outcompeted, or the rock will get flipped. But the most important part, the key to the success of these colonists, is speed. They grow quickly and they reproduce a lot at very young ages. However, there are some weaknesses to this strategy. In order to send out lots and lots and lots of propagules, each one of your propagules has to be very small. That means that if you end up in a place where resources are scarce, you're not going to be able to make a living. The other problem with being these little fast-growing organisms is that you can't be very efficient about your use of resources. And in general, fast-growing colonists are very sloppy about their resources. A lot of resources get wasted, but it doesn't matter to them because they're hoping to grow as fast as they can and get out of that area long before the resources run out. The other strategy you can have is what's called the competitor strategy. And that's what the red alga here does in this case. You've got organisms that grow very slowly. They may take a long time to reach maturity. And when they do, they may not make very many offspring. They may make relatively few propagules. Okay, but the few propagules that they make tend to be large and well equipped to compete. So that even if those propagules fall somewhere where there's not a lot of resources available, they're carrying with them a lot of resources. Okay, their parent, their mother, invested in that seed or that offspring a lot of nutrients, energy, maybe time and parental care that allow it to start out life with an advantage over offspring that come from little seeds. In addition, these species, these competitor species, tend to be very efficient in their use of resources, so that if they have to, they can just wait out these shorter-lived species. It may be that when a propagule of a red alga reaches a particular rock, it is covered with the sea lettuce and the barnacles. All that propagule can do is hunker down, find a place to make a living, and start growing very slowly. In the end, because these generally live longer, they're going to outlast these species. And so they will ultimately take over. The question is just how long it's going to take and what the mechanism is behind it. What's especially interesting about this rocky intertidal community is there are rocks where you can find all of these species, both the colonists and the competitors. And that's when you have rocks that are medium-sized. They don't flip over so often that the red alga can never get a foothold before the rock gets wiped clean again. But they don't take so long to flip over that the red alga always takes over from the sea lettuce and the barnacles. This is kind of a happy medium, and it forms the basis of what's called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. The idea being that you get very little diversity in a community when disturbance is extremely frequent, but you also get very little diversity in a community if disturbances are very rare. When you have intermediate rates of disturbance, that's when you have the maximum number of organisms that can make a living in a place, because there's room for both colonists and competitors.